Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are on a listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's conference. At that time, to ask a question, press *1 on your phone and record your name at the prompt. This call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to Leslie Green. Ma'am, you may begin.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in the series Women in Aging, titled Understanding Women's Sexuality at Midlife and Beyond. My name is Leslie Green, and I work in the Region 3 office at the Administration for Community Living in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. HHS Region 3 consists of Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. This is the third webinar in a 5-part series planned and coordinated by the HHS Region 3 office and the Philadelphia Corporation for Aging. Planning members include Sarah Shrimplin from the Office on Women's Health within the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health, and Kate Clark, who is both Planner for Policy and Program Development at the Philadelphia Corporation for Aging, and she's a 2013 to 2015 Atlantic Philanthropies Health and Aging Policy Fellow with the Office of the Surgeon General. This collaborative effort shadows the principles outlined in a document drafted by the Philadelphia Corporation for Aging called Aging and the National Prevention Strategy, and this document is aligned with the HHS National Prevention Strategy. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be archived. If you see a problem with participating in this recorded webinar, please disconnect now. And this event will include presentations from 2 experts within the aging field, followed by time for questions. And you have 2 options for participating in the Q&A session. You can wait until the end of the presentations when the operator will open the line for questions, or you can submit your questions by using the Q&A box in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. And now I'll give introductions to our featured presenters, Ms. Terry Clark and Dr. Eileen Warner-Marin. Terry has been doing work in health education, training, and facilitation for nearly 25 years and is currently the coordinator of prevention services at Action AIDS in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Terry is a member of Widener University's Consortium on Sexuality and Aging and an adjunct instructor at Arcadia University. She is a certified trainer with the National Resource Center on LGBT Aging and serves on the American Society on Aging's Leadership Council of their LGBT Aging Issues Network constituent group. She's also an advisory board member of Philadelphia Corporation for Aging's Primetime Health Committee. Throughout her career in public health, she has been an advocate for gender equality and sexual health across the life cycle. Dr. Warner-Marin has been practicing nursing for 33 years, specializing in the care of geriatric patients. In 2007, Dr. Warner-Marin completed her PhD in health policy that included a dissertation on HIV in the elderly, a study of how physicians, nurse practitioners, and older adults share information about HIV risk. She is an assistant professor at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine and is the co-director of the MS in Aging and Long-Term Care Administration program. Additionally, Dr. Warner-Marin is the owner of Alden Geriatric Consultants, Inc., which provides clinical expertise to long-term care facilities in the areas of wound management and corporate compliance, as well as medical legal issues involving long-term care residents. She is a court-appointed guardian for several at-risk individuals in the Philadelphia area. She is a fellow in the College of Physicians in Philadelphia. Her doctoral dissertation, as well as research agenda, has focused on the dissemination of information about HIV/AIDS to older adults. And now I'm going to pass things over to Terry and Eileen. Okay.
Thank you, Leslie and Sarah. Nice to be here today. We're going to be advancing the slides in just a minute. We ran into a little technical snafu, so just stay with us here. So I'd like to start with saying that sex and sexuality are human needs that evolve and change over our life cycle, and the need for intimacy is ageless. However, the topic of intimacy and aging is one that is overlooked when working with women in their midlife and older years. If we talk about successful aging, we need to include the role of intimacy in expressing our sexuality through our later years. In today's webinar, we will learn the difference between sex and sexuality, understand why we need to talk about sex and sexuality, examine common myths about women's sexual health and aging, and explain the PLISSIT model as a tool providers can use for talking about sexual health. Closeness, intimacy, and touch are lifelong needs that do not get old, even when we do. It is simply not true that when we are lighting dozens of candles on our birthday cake that we lose interest in sex, or that our lives as sexual beings are over. Sexuality evolves and changes as we age, but it is still very much a part of who we are until the day we die. And I want us to remember as we go through the material today about diverse needs. So when we talk about women in their midlife and later years, there's a lot of diversity within that group. And we have women who are living with a cognitive decline, women who are experiencing physical changes due to cancer and aging bodies, our living situations, so folks who are living independently versus in continuing care retirement communities or nursing homes. They will all have very different needs as we talk about this topic. And then certainly women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or beyond. So the decades of aging bring up a diversity of needs. And then our lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender women also have unique needs that need to be addressed when we're talking about this topic. And lastly, we cannot forget about the impact of culture, religion, family, race, all those other pieces of our identity on this topic. So as we go through the material today, just to remember about the diverse groups that we are talking about. So there are many facets of sex and sexuality, but too often the words are used interchangeably, and that may lead to a diminishing value of sexuality as we age. So let's talk about what is the difference between sex and sexuality. Sex can be referred to as our biological sex, our chromosomes, XX or XY, or some variation. We often use the words male, female, intersex to refer to our biological sex. Or sex could be defined as a range of behaviors that would ideally involve pleasure, consent, and protection against possible pregnancy and or other STIs, including HIV. Many people, older adults included, define sex differently. What do we mean by sex? Right? These were older adults that were sampled by the Kinsey Institute, and they found that 95% of these older adults said penile vaginal penetration was sex, but 11% said without ejaculation it wasn't sex. 30% of these older adults said oral penetration was not sex. 20% said anal penetration was not sex, and 23% of the men 65 and older said penile vaginal intercourse was not sex. So the implication here is that if older adults are not thinking of sex as sex, we as providers may miss an opportunity for information, for testing, for talking about risks, for talking about pleasure, a desire, etc. So sexuality is different. It's not just longhand for sex. Sexuality is the total expression of who we are as human beings and encompasses our whole psychosocial development, our values, attitudes, physical appearances, our beliefs, emotions, attractions, our likes, our dislikes, our spiritual selves, and it's influenced by our values, culture, socialization, politics, and laws. One model of sexuality is developed by Dennis Daly is the Circles of Sexuality model. In this model, I know that the screen may be a little small to read. You can find this widely available on the internet. But this is a holistic way of looking at sexuality. And because we have limited time today, I'm just going to really skim very quickly over these 5 circles. But you'll see that first one is called sensuality. And sensuality involves the way our bodies feel pleasure through our senses. That next circle refers to intimacy, and intimacy encompasses our emotional behavior such as need, trust, respect, loving or liking someone. Remember that need for intimacy is ageless. That third circle is titled sexual identity, and that's the piece of ourselves where we talk about our biological sex, our gender identity, our gender roles, and our sexual orientation, or who we are attracted to. And that fourth circle is sexual health, right? And sexual health in the reproduction circle is typically what people think about when they think about sex, right? So that's that STI prevention, contraception issues, pregnancy termination, the sexual health piece. And then finally, there's that circle of sexualization. And sexualization includes things about our sexuality that are often not, positive. Things like harassment or rape or misuse of power, withholding sex. And we know that women in their midlife and later years can be victims of sexual abuse. Certainly this is something that we talk about with elders under elder abuse. So just to be aware that is a piece of our sexuality, even though it is not one that is constructed in a positive way. And that middle circle is values. And in values, right, that's really the influencing factor of all these aspects of ourselves as sexual being, right? So in summary, the ability to express and enjoy one's sexuality leads to feelings of pleasure and well-being, feelings that are essential at any age if our human needs for intimacy and belonging are to be satisfied, and we are to age successfully. Right? Think about Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. Sexuality begins in utero as we are developing as human beings and ends with our death. And some people say sexuality is from the womb to the tomb. Okay, why do we need to talk about sex, right? The majority of older people, women, report that sex is important and find greater satisfaction in their sex lives as they age. Right? It has a direct relationship to the quality, or a correlation to the quality of their relationships. And women have concerns related to sex, intimacy, and sexuality. So if we're not talking about this as healthcare providers, then we're missing opportunities for education, for conversation, and really addressing needs that women have. It also reinforces an invisibility that older adults are not sexual or they don't have sexual needs or feelings. Sexual abuse, which I mentioned earlier, right? So if women are in abusive relationships, if there is sexual assault happening and we don't provide opportunities to talk about it, then we're missing one's needs. There are some complexities at the intersection of aging, incapacity, and sexuality. So when we talk about cognitive decline in Alzheimer's, that is a whole beyond the scope of this webinar, but a really important conversation about consent and what does that look like. Right? Sexual health issues, which we'll talk in more depth about today in a few minutes, and then certainly the benefits of aging through a lifetime, right? And many of you on the call see, Betty White there, and Betty White through the decades of her aging, right? So the psychological benefits, the social benefits, the biological benefits, raises our mood, enhances the quality of our life, right? Provides expression for affection and passion. And biological benefits, improves our sleep, restores energy, and it's fun. So let's go over quickly some myths and facts, right? So this idea that sex is a natural act, right? No, it's not. Everyone learned how to be sexual, and learning is necessary to accommodate an aging body, changing relationships, and an evolving life. Often the sexual scripts we learned when we were younger no longer work for us, right? So we have those changes to our bodies as we age, the thinning of our vaginal tissues, we have less lubrication, we may have, if we're having penetrative sexual behaviors, that may be uncomfortable, right? We may have more difficulty having an orgasm. So this idea that just sex is natural and we don't need to learn about it or talk about it, we do. And not only when we're maybe in our teenage years, but all the way throughout our life cycle as our needs continue to evolve and change, right? Many individual psychosocial and cultural factors play a role in how older adults perceive themselves as sexual beings, right? So this lifelong beliefs about sexual health certainly influence women in their mid-years and later years. Their general physical and psychological well-being, body image issues from aging changes, and cultural beliefs about sexual practice. So this myth that my libido is dead, so my sex life is over. So what we say about that is to go ahead and make a decision to say yes, to be sexually active, not to wait for moments to magically happen like they used to. The mood will kick in later. In order to desire it, do it. And this myth that we shouldn't talk about sex, right? Well, we better talk about sex. Lack of honest communication may be a cause for sexual dissatisfaction, perpetuating myths, and the occurrence of sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. So as we're going to transition now to Eileen's piece of the webinar, I want you to consider the following, right? As a practitioner, do you find it difficult to talk about sex? If so, think about why. Consider how you express your own sexuality. Do you assume that your patients are heterosexual? Do you make assumptions about the sexual behavior of your patients? For example, do you think that because they have long-term illness that they're not going to be interested in expressing their sexuality or in having sexual contact with their partner? Do you consider your patients to be sexually and or sexual health? Do you consider your patient's sexuality or sexual health needs? If so, how? And again, remember the diversity that we talked about in the beginning, and recognizing folks who are in same-sex relationships or trans women with their unique issues and concerns. So I'd like to transition now to Eileen, and she's going to be talking about sexual health.
Well, thank you. As I get started, I just wanted to identify that a lot of what I understand about older women and sexual health, it actually came from my mother, who's an 83-year-old woman who lives in Boca Raton, Florida, who maintains her sexual interest that's limited only by the loss of a partner. And of course, we have issues of where do you find appropriate partners as we get older, particularly when we have this demographic issue of lots and lots of older adult women and fewer potential older adult men as partners. So I wanted to identify that and also talk a little bit about 25 years ago when I started looking at this issue. I began working in senior centers doing lectures about safe sex and HIV. And issues came up that really amazed me as a nurse, as a relatively young nurse at that time. We had forums in which people were talking about their own personal identification of risk, and I recall one woman got up and said that she had had a hysterectomy when she was in her 40s, therefore she couldn't get HIV. And that really led me to these issues of trying to help men and women, but particularly women, understand what their risks are, what the issues were, and to go forward from that. So when we talk about sexual health, the World Health Organization talks about it as a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being. And in fact, when we see things on television, we have just the opposite feeling. We have the sense that people are described as dirty old men or dirty old women rather than anything consistent with this definition. So we really want to try to get people to think about sexual health as like breathing, like eating, like any other kind of function that keeps us in tune with life and engaged in society. So sexual health really requires that you have a positive, respectful approach, that you don't have it as a dirty thing, that people won't look at you as being low or of poor moral quality because you want to maintain your sexuality. In discussing issues of sexual health with older adults, as part of my dissertation, I found that a lot of physicians, nurse practitioners, and older adults saw several barriers. A lot of the older people thought that if they brought up issues of sexuality, then their provider would think less of them, particularly if they were already widowed, separated, or if they were single. And that feeling that the provider would then think less of them was really a major theme throughout our discussions. So giving people permission, as we'll talk about in this webinar, to discuss these kinds of issues is so important. Another issue was, will my provider think that I'm cheap if I'm a sexually active widow? And it's really difficult, I think, for health providers to think beyond the blood pressure, glucometer, the medical issues, what's the data, and really go beyond how is that person actually functioning in society, how are they engaged, how are they living their lives. It's very easy for us as healthcare providers to rely on those kind of data. What are the vital signs? What's the EKG? What's the chest X-ray? And much more difficult to really talk about the less concrete things, the things that we don't get reimbursed for, particularly sexuality. Another question, does my provider assume that I'm not sexual? Studies have shown that a lot of providers, particularly people who've been providing care for several years, really would prefer not to discuss sexuality issues with their patients and make assumptions that because people are of a certain age or a certain marital status, that they are no longer sexual. And that's something to be avoided in a patient-physician relationship or provider relationship. If the patient asks questions, will the person make the provider feel uncomfortable? And being uncomfortable was cited as one of the issues that both nurse practitioners, physicians, and patients said was one of the barriers to having any kind of dialogue about sexual health, HIV prevention, anything related to sex. And again, I think that health providers tend to rely on those numbers, the things that we get reimbursed for, those things that are real data, rather than thinking about things beyond that also are valid and of importance. So in talking about barriers to discussing sexual health issues from a healthcare provider standpoint, one of the people in my study actually showed me through her talk that the number of medical diagnoses that a patient presents with to an office visit is indirectly or inversely related to the number and severity of those diseases and our ability to even discuss sexuality. Therefore, if you're having issues of diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, those kinds of medical issues, the more of those medical issues you have, the less likely a provider is going to reserve any time to discuss sexuality or sexual health. So if you are a provider, try to make room for that kind of discussion. If you're not able to do it each and every visit, then perhaps just reserve some time during a visit every 2 or 3 times. One of the other things that was interesting, particularly from the nurse practitioners who I spoke with in my dissertation, were the fact that they didn't have publications, pamphlets, handouts, or other kinds of teaching guides that they could use to use as a tool to have that discussion. You couldn't really hand it to someone, say, look at that, and when you come back, we'll discuss it on their next visit. There was really nothing that they had in hand, and that caused them to be less likely to have this discussion. And we all know that one of the biggest barriers for anybody of any age to see a health provider is that limitation of time. You're always concerned about, am I taking up too much time? Will that doctor be rushed? Why is his hand on the door knob as I'm talking? And that becomes an issue. So staying out at the onset of the office visit, I'm here to discuss your health issues, and I would like to spend a couple minutes at the very end to answer any questions that you might have. Just putting that out as an agenda for your visit may be helpful. As we know from the armed services, there was a policy for a long time, don't ask, don't tell. And unfortunately, that don't ask, don't tell policy remains in effect in our doctors' offices with our physician assistants, with our nurse practitioners, and we really want to get away from that. It's not a policy that was successful in the armed services, and it certainly is not a policy that's effective in real-life care of human beings. Lastly, and this is a surprise to me, that I have a lot of health providers telling me that they don't want to discuss the health care of older women with an older adult woman in the office because that woman reminds them of fill in the blank, their mother, their grandmother, whoever. And I've never really run into that myself. I don't look at an older person and think, yes, she's just like my grandmother, or he's just like my grandfather. So I don't know why that is, but certainly it's something for us to address, but I don't think that that's an important, I think it is an important thing that we should consider how we personalize our patients and strategize how to get around that area. So often people say they don't know what to say, how to say it, or how to refer to the older woman who is sexually active, and you can simply just ask the question, do you need any information about safe sex or sex in general? Asking that question opens the door if people want that door open. If the person says, no, I don't need any information about safe sex, then you don't need to go any further. If they have further questions, then you can explore that with them. But simply asking that question, do you need any information about sexuality or safe sex, allows them that permission to ask those questions. And if not to you, then to who? So I believe that it should be the standard of care for primary care physicians to ask that question, for physicians, for nurse practitioners, for PAs, for all kinds of providers. And I do think that in my work, I see people prescribing Viagra, Levitra, Cialis, erectile dysfunction medications, and never even asking that question to those patients, let alone to a woman who walks into the office. As Terry talked about, we're going to introduce this concept of the implicit model. And this was a model that was coined by Jack Annan to assess people's readiness for discussions. And in this case, the readiness to discuss sexuality. And it gives people the permission to be able to raise these issues, and it acknowledges at the same time the possibility that that person would be sexually active and that they have a right to be sexually active. It provides limited information, specific or factual-based information that person may need to help figure out where they're going in this discussion, and then offers some more intensive therapy or strategies based on that kind of information. But the key thing here is, can you use it to to elicit this information from a patient? Tell me how you feel, how you express your sexuality. What kinds of concerns do you have? How do your needs for sexuality get expressed? And that allows that person to open up and begin this dialogue with the person in the office. Let's talk for a second about older adults and HIV. When I began my senior center talks about 25 years ago, only about 8 to 10% of all the HIV cases in the United States were in people over the age of 50. Unfortunately now, in 2016, 50%, that's 50%, 50% of people in the United States with HIV/AIDS are over 50. The diagnosis is not made in the community as with younger adults, but usually done in ICU when the person's having a serious health crisis, and people had never before considered the possibility that their health issues were related to an underlying HIV infection. Older women, as well as older men, but older women in particular, are at risk for the transmission due to their aging immune systems, the biological changes, particularly in vaginal dryness, vaginal thinning, and when the vagina is less lubricated than it should be, it allows for micro tears and allows for the virus to be transmitted much more easily to an older woman. And in my study, which was in a section of Philadelphia on HIV, we found that there were lots of men who paid prostitutes in Philadelphia for sex, and then as their money began running out from Social Security towards the end of the month, and they would have sex with older women closer to their age. And the older women may or may not have known that men were having sex with prostitutes, but that was one of the mechanisms in which women were being exposed to the virus. There was a lack of negotiation also on the part of women, particularly women of color, and there's literature to support that older women of color are less likely to demand condom use from their partners. They have a lack of an ability to negotiate. And I think that's a common problem with all women, women of all ages, but we see that even more so in women of color. And we don't see any kind of advertisements that this is the face of aging. We don't see buses going down the street with an older woman's face saying this is the face of aging, as we do for younger adults. So what do we know about older adult women and their need for sexuality? We know that there's a need to have them understand about lubricants, particularly water-based lubricants, in order to make sure that they don't have micro tears, that they're not dry when they're engaged in sex. We know that they have a need to explore what feels good to them and to be able to tell that to their partner, which is perhaps something that they're not used to doing at all. We know that they need to learn how to protect themselves, and although many older adults have told me during the course of my work that they can look at someone and know that they're clean because they go to church and that person just looked right, we know, in fact, that that's not true, and we really want to get people the sense of getting used to using condoms, female condoms, where to get them, how to use a vibrator, where to get that, and how to find resources for information on sexuality. So what we've seen is a real lack of conversations about sexual health with older adults. And I assume that the audience who is listening to us today haven't had those conversations or haven't been or think that those conversations don't happen as often as they should. I think that we don't see billboards with messages to older adults saying that it's okay to be sexually active, that it's okay to ask questions, that being at risk for HIV doesn't change, that HIV doesn't care how old you are, and that all other sexually transmitted infections that are prominent now that weren't when they were younger are still problematic and should be discussed with older adults. We think that it's unlikely that HIV testing campaigns have hit your grandmother, but really need to. And we also believe that programs that teach older adult women about how to use female condoms are really very important. So information about healthy relationships and maintaining sexuality in later life are so important, and the dialogue begins today. Here's some information about prevention messages for older adults, and as you can see from the slide, one of them uses the slogan, "Age is not a condom," just to remind people that just because you're older doesn't mean that HIV is no longer an issue or has never been an issue for you. And now I'm going to turn the program back over to Sarah for our question and answer period.
Excellent. Thank you so much, ladies. That was so wonderful. And so as Eileen just said, we're going to go ahead and start the Q&A at this time. Alyssa, could you please open up the lines?
Absolutely. If you would like to ask a question, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone. Make sure your phone is unmuted and record your name clearly when your name will be required to introduce your question. If you need to withdraw your question, press *2. Again, to ask a question, please press *1 and record your name. It will take a moment for questions to come through. Please stand by.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And so we'll go ahead and we'll start with, we've got a nice response online utilizing the chat box. For starters, this one, it looks like it's good for you, Terry. It is important to talk about a partner's sexual history. Can you please share when it is the right time to ask about someone's sexual history, and what is the best way to approach that?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think some people, really start this conversation before they even kiss or get emotionally involved. And others wait until the topic of sexual activity comes up. It may be, for some people, days, weeks, or months. But if you can begin to share histories before you engage in any type of genital contact with someone, is ideal. And we know that kissing and hugging and fondling and masturbation, those are really, no-risk activities. But when we're talking about sexual history, usually folks want to know about STIs and HIV. So pick a private place where you won't be interrupted or overheard, and when you're relaxed, assure your partner or your partners that you will keep the conversation confidential and that you expect the same in return. And you don't need to ask for names and dates and all the details, right? But you do need enough information to assess any health risks that you might expose yourself to. Right? Be willing to share your own story. Start by giving your own answers to these questions, and then ask your potential partner, questions such as this. Have you ever participated in intercourse, oral sex, vaginal sex, or anal sex without a condom? Have you ever had unprotected sex with somebody who is HIV positive or someone who has herpes or hepatitis? What were the results of the test for STIs that you recently had, or were you recently tested for sexually transmitted infection, right? And then some people say, well, I want to see proof, right? I want to see the paperwork. I want to see the lab report. And I think that for some people, yes, that's really important, but we also have to remember sort of what's the question behind the question. And if we're beginning a relationship, or we're already in an established relationship, and it's moving towards sexual contact in intercourse and penetrative behaviors that may bring some risk there, there's an element of trust that can't be overstated. So if we're asking our partner for proof, what does that really say about the larger relationship and maybe our own issues, or bigger conversations around trust and intimacy and vulnerability, etc. And then we also want to be aware that if folks have used injection drug equipment, so people who are, IDUs, injection drug users, that poses also risk for HIV and hepatitis. So you want to put that out on the table. And again, as Eileen had said earlier, You know, a lot of times we just look at someone and say, oh, they smell clean or they look clean or, oh, they're this demographic or they're that age and they must be okay. But we really cannot make assumptions about our own personal partners or those folks that we're providing health care to. So, great question. Thanks, Sarah.
Excellent. Thank you, Terry. And we'll just see if, Alyssa, if there's anyone that has utilized your option.
I show no questions through the phones, but again, if you'd like to ask a question, please press *1 and record your name.
Excellent. Thank you. So the next one we're looking at I think might be a good one for Eileen. For many older women I know, body image is a big deal. I hear stories of embarrassment and low self-esteem. Can you share some ideas for addressing one's body image and aging?
Well, that's a great question also. The issue is really complicated and made more complicated by not only how we look differently in our 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s than we did when we were in our 20s, but also things like incontinence, the occasional urinary incontinence, which is a common problem in older adult women in particular. Stress incontinence with difficulty in holding on to urine when the person coughs, laughs, sneezes, or picks something heavy up off the ground. And the intimacy issues that poses when people are, when women in particular have trouble with continence. One common issue also that you see is what happens when women have mastectomies, one or bilateral mastectomies. That's a huge change. And another one also are colostomies. So what people do is, talk about this first. And they may decide to wear certain articles of clothing to cover certain parts up. But whatever makes them feel most comfortable and still allows them to feel sexual. Most people will talk to their partners about how they feel about their the lack of a breast or their colostomy or whatever it is that they have. And with regard to the incontinence issue, having a towel under you as you're engaged in sex could be really very helpful and make you feel more comfortable and allow that kind of body image issue to be kind of put on the back burner with the focus more on the sexuality.
Excellent. Thank you, Eileen. Let's see. Another one. Can you talk about older women who have a same-sex partner and worry about their healthcare provider who won't approve of their sexual orientation? What suggestions do you have for coming out to one's provider?
Oh, that's a great question, and really important that lesbian women, bisexual women, transgender women, find providers who they can come out to or disclose their sexual orientation. And the reason that's important is because if we're not able to talk about our entire selves in an open, honest way with our healthcare provider, then we may not be getting the care we need. It's a barrier to, optimal health care. And unfortunately, there are doctors and there are healthcare providers who are not accepting of non-heterosexual patients, to look for someone who is. So the way that you may sort of test the waters, if you will, is to see if there a good resource is the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association, right? So Association GLMA, Gay Lesbian Medical Association, that has providers who are GLBT identified themselves. There's also the Human Rights Campaign, and they have an equality index. So they actually go out to different kinds of hospitals and healthcare providers and health networks and train and give them information about how that provider can provide inclusive, welcoming services. So using that index, that Human Rights Campaign Equality Index for healthcare, can be a great source of information. The other suggestion is to, go to trusted friends or colleagues and, find out who they've had a good experience with the health provider, and that maybe they can describe the care that they received or what it was like for them to come out to their health care provider. And you could call your local LGBT center. If you don't have an LGBT center, you might want to go to those resources I mentioned earlier. And if your provider does come across as not welcoming, really not to continue in that relationship. And your patient care, your care of yourself is that person you are, really deserves to have someone who is accepting of you and can meet your needs.
Excellent. Thank you, Terry. Well, we've got another one that we could go to, but let's just quickly see if Alyssa has anything for sharing.
I show no questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, thank you, Alyssa. So another question, can you explain why older women are more at risk for STI, HIV infection rather than younger women?
Well, part of this actually has to do with the vaginal secretions and the lubrication. And we know that after menopause, and the average age of menopause is about 51, when we no longer produce estrogen from our ovaries, we no longer menstruate, that has an effect on lots of different parts of our body, including our ability to be continent, to hold our urine. It has to do with the hydrostatic factors, and it also has to do with the lubrication of the vaginal area, of the vaginal canal. So when we're dry and we go to have penetrative sex, if that person is not well lubricated, then we get these micro tears that allow the HIV virus or any other kind of bacteria or viruses to be transmitted more easily into that woman. The biggest problem, though, is that, because HIV wasn't around when a lot of these women came of age, that their understanding and knowledge of what they need to do, to prevent any kind of STDs, including HIV, all their knowledge is really limited to what they knew when they were younger, and may not include the kinds of things that we're talking about today. So it's important to explore those kinds of issues with the female older adult patient. What do you know? What do you need to know in order to enhance that kind of understanding? So that's part of the reason. And it's very hard sometimes to find female condoms. When I would introduce the concept of a female condom in the senior centers, they were perfectly amazed. Women who were able to use diaphragms when they were younger were much more able to get the concept of the female condom. Those who hadn't actually seen anything like that before were also really fascinated by it. But when you go into a drugstore, even in a supermarket, you'd be hard-pressed to find a female condom on the shelves. And I think that issue is really one of the things that keeps this issue in the closet, is that if you go to a drugstore or a supermarket, you'll see reams and reams of male condoms and not a single female condom, at least not where I am. So hopefully people will rise up and demand female condoms in their stores.
Great, thanks, Eileen. Let's see, we've got, I think this might be a good one for, well, Terry, but Eileen, you might too have some thoughts on this. How can someone decide what kind of personal lubricant and brand or type of condom to use?
Well, that is another great question. I think that, it really boils down to a personal preference or personal choice when we're looking at condoms and lube. We know that with condoms, in the male condom, there's a whole different kinds of brands and sizes. There's non-latex condoms for folks who have latex allergies. Certainly the female condom, which is Eileen has mentioned. There are latex condoms, natural skin condoms. And we know sort of from the effectiveness of condoms that if condoms are used correctly and consistently, that they do prevent the transmission of HIV and STIs. When it comes to lubricants, the recommendation is to use a silicone-based or a water-based lubricant. And again, there are many on the market. I would steer clear from flavored lubes or flavored lubricants because they have sugar in them, and putting sugar into your vagina will cause likelihood of a bacterial infection, and just not recommended. But really, there are many different lubes on the market. Some women are using olive oil, coconut oil, and they find great success with that. So my recommendation is really just to find something that works for you. I don't want to go ahead and put any brands out there in a favoritism, but there's some great resources out there, and really just to find one that works for you.
Well, and it's interesting, Terry. So there have been a number of questions about lubrication, so it seems like that's a topic people are interested in. But also, there was a question as well about vibrators, which I have a feeling you might say that you can't side with one or another, but do you have any thoughts on that?
So these are really, really great questions, and I'm thrilled that you all are asking them, because this is the kind of information that we need to be able to talk about with older adults and asking these questions. So in using vibrators, again, trying to find one that works best for you. There are vibrators that are used more internally and have different kinds of, in different shapes that would pleasure the G-spot. Some are larger, some are smaller, some are pocket size that you can keep well within your, your backpack or your purse and take them on the road with you, if you will. Others are larger. There's also dildos. The difference between a dildo and a vibrator is that a dildo it does not vibrate, so it's still, in the shape of, well, many people would say they're in phallic shapes, or the shape of a penis, or something that would be inserted into the vagina. Vibrators also, for older women who have, sometimes if they have mobility issues or arthritis, finding a vibrator that's easy to turn on and off, or that has the buttons, the control buttons are large enough to see without your glasses is an important consideration. I think, the Magic Wand was a vibrator that was one of the first ones that was on the market, and it's still available today. Many older women will find that they need to use a vibrator in order to achieve orgasm, and this is not unusual. It's perfectly, within the realm of aging for many of us, and that using a vibrator to reach orgasm is, again, like I said, something many, many women do. So finding a powerful vibrator to help you achieve orgasm or pleasure is another piece of that. So, great question.
Thanks, Terry. Well, before we move on to the next question, we have a participant who utilized the chat line and asked that we please provide the website healthywomen.org as a good resource for materials and health education around women and sexuality. So that's just something for folks to note. So before we move on to another question provided via the chat line, I'm curious, does Lissa have anyone on her end interested in asking a question?
I'm showing no questions in the queue.
Okay, thank you, Alyssa. So another question. Let's see. Although I have thought about asking my healthcare provider questions about sexual health, they always seem rushed and there isn't any time to discuss sex during my visits. How can I get my questions answered?
Well, you want to go in with a list, a written list of questions and issues that you want to discuss. And this is whether or not it's sexuality or your diabetes. You want to go in with a list of your questions and be prepared. And that way your provider knows that you've given thought to what it is that you want to discuss that you have an agenda and you're willing to be able to share that information during that course of that visit and even put those questions into the chart. So I would suggest that you get all the questions out, written down that you need, and be able to at least address some of those, and let your provider know that you want those kinds of things. If they can't talk to the provider, then who would they talk to? And if they can't answer all of those questions during that session, then when they come back the next time for their follow-up appointment, that they want to be able to continue that discussion. But being rushed is something that's really not therapeutic, but we all unfortunately face that in our current healthcare delivery system. We have to make time for the questions that are really important to us. And you can begin by saying, hey, doctor, I know that my diabetes is important, I know that my blood pressure is important, and I'm doing those kinds of things to address that, but I also want to address my sexuality issue. And that way you're letting the doctor know that you're acknowledging the importance of those health conditions, but you need to move beyond those conditions.
Excellent. Thanks, Eileen. Another question. Can we talk a little more about ED, and I'm assuming that person means erectile dysfunction drugs and other prescriptions for older men?
Yes. So older men will often request ED, erectile dysfunction medication from their providers. And there's a couple of things to be aware of. Number one, the provider is probably not talking about using condoms along with the erectile dysfunction medication. And men are getting ED medication for one reason, and that is to have an erection, and that's typically to have penetrative sex with their partner. So it really goes hand in hand that if someone is having penetrative sex, that we need to be talking about condoms. And that conversation is not happening at the provider-patient level. The other really important thing to remember about this is that not everybody enjoys or wants penetrative sex, and that we grow up with the message that penetrative sex is the goal, and that if we're not especially for men, if their penises are not working like they were when they're 20, at 50, 60, 70, or 80, that there's something wrong with them, and that you know, ED drug is the fix. Well, the brain is the most important sex organ. So it's really not necessarily sometimes even about the ability to have an erection. It could be, you know, some issue with their relationship or with their own body image or their own self-concept, with their sexual self-esteem. So that pill is not going to solve those larger issues around their relationship or their sexual self-esteem. And we've also found that some men don't disclose to their partners that they're taking erectile dysfunction drugs. So that's, to me, kind of a red flag, that if you're in this intimate relationship with folks but you're not disclosing, you know, that you're taking this medication, you know, what's the reason for wanting that? So much larger discussions around the quality of the relationship and the intent in the relationship. And we've also found that men who begin to take erectile dysfunction drugs often discontinue the prescription within, you know, a few months of starting to take them. So again, it's not a magic bullet solution. Again, just to emphasize that there's a lot of wonderful intimate behaviors that can happen without penetrative sex, and we call that outer course. Thanks.
And I just wanted to add a couple of words about that. When I was getting ready to do my dissertation, I interviewed a urologist, and I wanted to know what it was that he would ask people before prescribing or at the time of prescribing these meds. And he said, I tell them to take it before meals or after meals. And I said, no, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. What kind of advice do you give about safe sex? And he looked at me and said, safe sex, why would I discuss that? That's not my job. And I thought, you know, there's probably a common misconception that this doctor had, that it wasn't his job, but he's prescribing a medication. He's essentially putting bullets in the gun. I think you really need to talk to the person about safety. The other issue about that, I have come across a woman whose husband was taking these ED meds, and she said that she now keeps control of that prescription, and that in their older age, she initiates it, she gives him the pill, and she now is in control of their sexual activities for the first time during their entire marriage. So I thought, isn't it interesting that erectile medications, erectile dysfunction medications can be used to change the dynamics of the relationship in a way that puts the woman in control more than the man.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Eileen. That was a really good addition to that question. Goodness. Well, unfortunately, we're at the conclusion of the hour. There have been a number of other questions that were submitted online. We'll actually go ahead and we'll leave the chat box open for at least 5 minutes after the webinar has concluded, and that way, if there's anything else that you want to submit, please feel welcome to send those questions, and the presenters will be, those questions will be shared with the presenters, as well as if you think of any questions after the fact, let's say later this evening or tomorrow, I've posted the contact information through Rosie May Henson, and I encourage you to send those questions to her, and she'll go ahead and compile those and share them with the presenters. Like we've done with the other 2 webinars, we're sharing questions associated with the presentations with the presenters, and we're sharing those answers to the questions when we share the archive webinars with participants. So please know that hopefully within the next week we'll be able to send out to you the archived webinar link as well as the recording and the presentation that you just viewed. So thank you so much for participating in today's webinar. Again, if you have any questions about this series or about what you've learned today, please feel free to reach out to Rosie May Henson. And again, you'll notice her email is noted at the bottom of the slide. Again, thank you so much. It was a great dialogue, and we look forward to hopefully continuing these conversations in the future. Have a good day. And Alyssa, again, if you would please leave this line open, the webinar running for another 5 minutes, so folks can still look at this information online. Thank you.
Absolutely. This concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect your lines at this time.